Hi, I'm Joan Newberger, and we're here today with Bill Brands. Hi, Bill.
Hi, Joan.
As H.W. Brands, he is the author of around 20 books. We're going to be talking about his most recent book, The Man Who Saved the Union, Ulysses Grant in War and Peace. So, Bill, you've written a number of books about presidents. What attracted you to Grant?
Yeah, I'd written about other presidents, but I had worked my way around the Civil War. I figured I was going to come back to that, and I couldn't decide whether to do Lincoln, who's kind of the obvious choice, or Grant, who's somewhat less obvious. I also wanted to look at someone who became famous primarily for being a soldier, because soldiers, warriors, whatever you want to call them, for better or worse, have played a huge role in human history. And I wanted to figure out what makes them do what they do.
Mm-hmm. And so what role did being a military man, a soldier, play in Grant's personality and in his role as a president?
Well, let me first talk about how Grant became a soldier and why he was a good soldier. Because he became president because he was the hero of the Civil War. And it was as simple as that. In American politics, you win a big war, you can be president if you want to be. But Grant discovered fairly early on that he didn't have that many gifts for very many things. He went to West Point almost reluctantly. His father had managed to get him in without even informing him that he was going to go. He got to West Point. He was good with horses, which always was a leg up if you're going to be a soldier. And once he actually got out and got into battle during the Mexican War, he discovered that he wasn't afraid in battle. He thought more clearly in battle than he did at other times. And he realized that a military calling suited him. And then the war ended, the Mexican War ended, and the Army was largely disbanded. And he spent the 1850s really floundering, trying to find himself. And he had settled into steady mediocrity when the South seceded and the Civil War began. And that really rescued him from what would have been an utterly nondescript life.
That is one of the most interesting things about Grant, that his total lack of success outside of the military. And then at the same time, he becomes president.
Yeah. Well, it turns out that it's not all that uncommon for people who are good at war not to be good at much else. William Sherman was probably even a better example. Sherman was a brilliant guy, but he just could not find himself, except during war. There's something about war that imposes a singleness of purpose on what you're doing. You really don't have to worry what other people think about you. You just have to figure out how to win your battle and your campaign. If you do, you're the hero. If not, well, you'll be forgotten along with everybody else. But you can look at Sherman, you can see it in Grant, you can see it in Robert E. Lee, you can see it in a few other generals. This was what they were born for. Few of them would have said they welcomed the war coming, but once the war came, they thrived in its context.
So Lincoln seems to be almost the opposite kind of person, someone very comfortable with conflict, with complication, with difficult problems, even if he couldn't always solve them. How did Grant and Lincoln, what was their relationship like?
Lincoln had had a succession of generals before Grant who were, for the most part, pretty good at preparing for battle, but just couldn't make that critical decision to launch the campaign, to go into battle. One of the things that Grant had, that Lincoln recognized, was a trait that is, well, to me as his biographer, that's simultaneously admirable and appalling. And that is the ability, the willingness to give the order that you know will inevitably result in the deaths of thousands of young men. Grant's previous generals couldn't do it. They just didn't have, well, is it the steel of character? Is it the utter conviction that your cause is correct? I'm not sure exactly why they didn't, but Grant did. And Lincoln observed Grant in the Western Theater in the campaign for Vicksburg and concluded that, as Lincoln said, this general fights. And that's what he wanted. He immediately recognized that Grant was the one who was going to carry the Union to victory.
Now, you also argue that Grant wasn't such a bad president.
Yes.
Certainly that's his reputation.
Well, you mentioned earlier that Lincoln recognized the complexities of life. Yeah, that's true at a personal level. But as president, Lincoln had a relatively straightforward, not necessarily easy, but a relatively straightforward task. Because just as for the soldiers, for the generals, for the president, once you go to war, it's really straightforward what you have to do. You have to win. Lincoln's best career move, if I might put this kind of cynically, was to be killed right at the end of the war. Because if Lincoln had lived into Reconstruction, then his reputation would have gotten all messed up. Again, during war, you win, you're the hero. But once the war is over, that's when things got difficult. Because the South was going to be reintegrated into the Union, and democracy would require that Southerners be able to determine their fate. But what do you do? And this is another point I raise with my students. What do you do in a democracy when a majority of people advocates, supports a policy that is essentially immoral?
And not democratic.
Well, no, the problem is, I mean, just to take slavery before the war, slavery was a perfectly democratic institution. It was endorsed by a majority of people in the South, a majority of people in the country as a whole. And now, it's true that the slaves themselves weren't part of the democratic system,
right.
But that's
Small
always a
problem.
drawback. Well, yeah, but I mean, there are always people who are not represented. But the problem is, I mean, frankly, even if they had been represented, they would have been outvoted. And so here's the problem. And this was the fundamental problem of Reconstruction. The South was not reconciled to equality or anything approaching civil rights for African Americans. That had become the law of the land, but the question is, would it be the law of the South? And the United States has this democracy that's complicated by the federal system, where there's the level of operation of national law, and then there's the level of operation of state law. And what was the combination of the two? Yeah, it's true that historians like to say that the Civil War settled that issue. No, the only issue it settled was that Southern states could not leave the Union. But if they remain in the Union, how do they enforce laws? Do they enforce them selectively? It turns out that they did. That's what Grant had to battle with.
And so, do you think that anyone could have dealt with the complications of Reconstruction better than Grant? You're saying that this was such a hard problem.
No one available could have. And it's really hard to imagine, even theoretically, that someone could have dealt with it better, simply because it was an utterly intractable problem.
Let's talk about writing a biography.
Okay.
You've written biographies of other presidents and other people. Mm-hmm. What made Grant's biography different or interesting for you? What did you like writing this book?
I did. I liked writing the book because I found Grant to be a very interesting and engaging person. Mm-hmm. I've written about people who were, well, engaging, some who weren't so engaging. I wrote about Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was somebody who had an engaging public persona, but up close he'd just wear you out because he was one of those people who insisted on just being right in your face and being the center of attention. Grant was very understated. Grant was a relatively humble guy. He knew what he was good at, he knew what he wasn't good at. But the challenge of writing biography to me is to figure out what makes this person tick. And I will say that the longer I do this, the less I engage in academic and political arguments about, I wrote about Franklin Roosevelt. Was the New Deal a good deal or was the New Deal a bad deal? And I've got sort of a rationalization or a justification for not engaging that particular debate because I want to write an account of a life that can be instructive to people both who agreed with Roosevelt, let's say, or disagreed with him. Because my point is not to pass judgment on the past. It's to illuminate the past. So with Grant, what I really wanted to figure out was how this guy, who did not impress his contemporaries at West Point, who did not impress the people who knew him during the 1850s, how did he become the outstanding figure of his age? And he really was. He was more famous, he was more beloved than anybody in the United States from about 1865 until the end of the century. Lincoln eventually became the martyr, but Grant was the hero. And in America, the heroes of the wars are the heroes of the people. He was elected twice. He could have been elected 3 or 4 times if he had simply given the word, but he chose not to. And so, what does it tell us about this individual? And then, because I'm a historian and my biographies are always lives and times, what does it tell us about the country at the time that he lived? And so, what do we learn about Grant? What do we learn about the United States by looking at this particular individual?
I tell my kids all the time that life is a long race, and that when things aren't going that well, it's just this time around the track. It's going to be a long race. And Grant just seems like a great example of that.
Oh, no question about it. He was 40 years old before anybody saw anything that was worth emulating.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.